All right, everybody, welcome to week number 1 of the SC Online Bible Study. We are super excited that you're joining us. You are going to want to tune in for the next 6 weeks because we're going to have great content. It is all about the story going from Exodus and how it points us to Easter. It's the perfect time because Easter's going to be coming up at the end of this, and you're going to be able to see how God used the story of Exodus to deliver his people, but really that story of redemption, it is so important to you. And in today's, you're going to get to hear from Brandon Braun, who put together a lot of the materials you're reading and are a part of each week. But then I'm also excited you're going to get to hear from Ashley Weece. Ashley, you'll recognize her from the weekends, but also she gets to work right alongside Kyle and really helps develop many of our sermon series that you know and love. So she's a great resource of knowledge. So thank you for joining us. Now, here's Brandon, here's Ashley as we do week number 1 of From Exodus to Easter. All right, guys, so we are doing the study from Exodus to Easter, which is super interesting, and it may not make sense that Exodus would point to Easter and that the story of the Exodus, the story of the nation of Israel would point to it, but there is so many powerful images that pop up through the story of Exodus. So before we get into today's real content of today, I'd love to just zoom way out for a second and hear from you. When you hear Exodus, all right, as leaders and teachers of God's word, when you hear the Exodus, what do you think of when you think of the Exodus? What comes to mind first?
Let me tell you what it came to mind when I was, initially a new kind of Bible reader.
Sure.
Exodus was like that book that you kind of go, okay, as I'm reading the Bible through, in a year, I'm trying to get through this. Because I don't really know. I don't really know what.
Intimidating.
Honestly, the whole Old Testament, you're kind of like, what? I don't know what to do with it. But as I've kind of grown and learned, this is kind of the idea that I've come to with Exodus. It's really simple, and it's an alliteration because
I love it.
Nice.
you can't when you're preaching.
you got to.
Exodus is everywhere.
Yeah.
It's literally everywhere. So, it's everywhere in Scripture. It's everywhere in our own spiritual journey, and it's everywhere in culture. And that's kind of one of the things I love about this book is just you find so many things in it. There's stories about deliverance, about power, about government, about oppression, stories that are really personal, stories where you're like, is God doing something here, or is it just this lifelong, never-ending journey of suffering? It's just a really fun book to get to unpack a little bit more that I didn't even realize when I was first reading the Bible.
Yeah.
So,
What do you think of, Brandon?
Well, maybe I shouldn't admit this early in the study. Like, I was thinking about, what do I think of when I think of Exodus? I think of the Prince of Egypt.
Oh,
Like that movie.
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
I don't know. Like, it gets some things wrong.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the things that it does really
And if you want
right
a
are
full
like,
listing of all the wrong things,
Yes. Yeah.
Brandon's your guy.
yeah. Moses didn't sing. No, I don't know. But like, I feel like for some reason, it just so perfectly encapsulates some of that story.
That's
I
really
think, and it
good,
does so
yeah.
many really good things that I'm like, oh, I think, and there are so many things I actually kind of learned about Exodus or thought about in that movie. It was the first time I really considered like Moses is going back to people he knows and having to say, hey, let my people go. But beyond a cartoon, I guess I just think of some of the stories in Exodus and, Moses in the burning bush. I think everyone who's in ministry can relate to that story and look at it and feel like, yeah, I felt that way when God called me to do this.
Yeah.
Like I argued with him and didn't want to do it. And finally I was like, okay, let's go.
Yes.
So I just think there are so many stories, like Ashley said, that kind of catch the status of the life that we're in and how we even feel today, even though we're thousands of years beyond them, that we can look at that story and say, yeah, that's me. Like, I've been there.
And the imagery is so rich. Pay attention to the number of days, the number of years, the parallels between what happens there is what God does later. And they're going to come to life that we'll bring out with each week of this, as we're reading along. You'll hear about things about the 10 plagues and Passover, parting of the Red Sea, Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, the covenant, the tabernacle, like all these big key themes to the story of what God is doing begins with the story of the Exodus. The other thing I don't want to miss is it shows up all throughout the New Testament.
Yeah.
My personal favorite is the tabernacle was where God resided while they were wandering, and we'll get to this later on, but it was just a tent. At the end of the day, it was God was in a tent, and I love that in John chapter 1, right? When Jesus comes, it says in there, you guys know the language stuff better than me, but when Jesus came and said he made his dwelling among us, it's not a dwelling, it's he made his tent.
He tabernacled.
He tabernacled among us, and you see that's intentional language there. What else in the New Testament, when you think of the Exodus, do you guys think about?
Talking about Jesus, there's the moment of the transfiguration when Moses appears with Jesus, and it says that Moses and Jesus discussed Jesus' departure, and the word used there is Jesus' exodus, his exodus from the earth, and it's just kind of interesting. I kind of wonder what that conversation was, right? Like Moses is talking about his exodus, Jesus is talking about his, and you know that same language comes up that Jesus is departing, he's exiting. This earth, and his departure is going to involve salvation, and you know it's going to involve freedom.
Yeah, I think of it like, you know, when we talk about the tabernacle was the tent of meeting. It was the place where God's presence dwelled, and God's presence would move as His people moved. Then we had the temple, and the temple is, you know, a permanent fixture where God's presence dwells. And now, you know, it's fun to see. 1 Corinthians says, "Don't you know that you yourself are God's temple, and God's Spirit dwells with you?" And so we see this come full circle where wherever we move, God's presence is with us. You know, that's what we get to talk about when we talk about the tabernacle. But all of this imagery just becomes so rich whenever you realize, oh my goodness, you know, there's so many words, like so many words in the Old Testament, so many words in Exodus that you see pop up throughout the New Testament. I wrote down a few. There's redemption, redeem, deliver, deliverance, ransom, purchase, slavery, freedom. You know, all these words that all of a sudden it just, you have this new picture of it when you really read the Exodus story and think of it with that lens on, you know, that whole New Testament lens on.
Yeah, and the thing I don't want to miss in the story of the Exodus and how it applies today, and I want to put this at the beginning, and then we're going to begin the story. But at the end of the day, the story of the Exodus is that God's people are enslaved for 400 years. And then he leads them out of slavery into the promised land. And with the story of Jesus, I love the parallel. The time between the testaments is about 400 years. And then Jesus comes, a better Moses, and he leads his people, you and I, for all time, out of slavery and into the promised land. And the slavery is sin, right? And the promised land is what is yet to come. And right now we're in that wandering period that you see as before, right? Where God is tabernacling with us and in us and through us. And so I love that. It's such a beautiful, beautiful backdrop. But Brandon, before we can really begin the story of the Exodus, we've got to get how this happened. So it all really, where we're beginning the Bible reading plan and the Bible study is with the story of the very end of Genesis. And I love this. You pointed out, Brandon got a Hebrew Bible because he would. And he says this, the very first word in the Hebrew Bible of Exodus, the very first word is what?
And.
The word is and.
Yeah. So our English translations don't pick it up. But Moses starts this second book with the word and just saying, okay, we're picking up what's come before.
You've got to have some confidence to start a book with and.
Yes. You have read the first one.
Yeah, obviously.
And so now let's get going.
The first one. It was really good.
Yeah. But it's interesting to me that there's some bravery there. There's also, I guess, a little bit of foresight to think, oh, God is going to tell a story here.
It's really good.
And this is chapter 2. Like, let's just get moving on this. And it's really neat to have to go back and pick that up and say, okay, well, what is this and here? You know, what is Moses referring to, and how did we get here? Which is something I think we all have to ask in our own lives is like, well, what's happened before this, right? Like my book is not the first chapter here. So what is the and? What's come before here? What's led to this moment? And how do we go forward?
I love that. And the and that he's referring to is where we're going to pick up the story. At the end of Genesis is the story of one of the most faithful, most interesting characters. There's so much written about him. I was sat down this morning and was rereading all of it, and it took me way longer than I planned because there's so many words about Joseph. Right. And that's who we're going to be talking about is Joseph. And so the way to tell his story is we're going to do it kind of in 3 different movements, right? So movement 1 is his childhood, and he is the favorite son. What does that mean that he's the favorite son? Like, how did that come about? Brandon, you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so Jacob's household is a mess. He
Simple,
married,
yeah.
he married two sisters, Rachel and Leah. I always want to say Leia, like Star Wars, but Rachel and Leah. And he loved Rachel more.
Yeah.
And it was evident to everybody. But Leah was able to have children, and Rachel for a long time wasn't. But Rachel finally did get pregnant. She had a boy, and his name was Joseph. And so because Joseph is the first child of his favorite wife, like he loves Joseph.
Yeah.
And he does everything for Joseph. And all the other kids know it. You know, he's got, 10 other boys and a daughter, Dinah. And they know that Joseph is the favored son. He gives Joseph, this amazing colored coat and sets Joseph apart as just, this is my favorite son. So much so that Joseph knows it, I think. Because he has dreams where, I had this dream where all these other stars came and bowed down to me.
Yeah.
And the brothers are pretty clear, like, oh, he's talking about us.
I know, and it's so interesting to me because I'm like, Joseph, you should figure out by now that you don't tell people that you have that dream, especially your brothers.
So the dream basically elevates that they're going to one day, and God fulfills this, and that's what we'll talk about today, but like they're going to one day bow down to him.
Yeah.
When you think about Joseph, the early years, what do you think about, Ashley?
I think about this story of someone who knows God's going to do something with them, but they don't fully know what that looks like. Yeah. And it's this story where it's really interesting where, he does know the dream. And I think all of us, he sees this dream that God has obviously going to use him in a really unique way. Yeah. He tells his brothers, and I think that he really just trusts and believes that God's going to use him, but his brothers aren't in the same place as him. And honestly, the story of Joseph really reminds me, as we watch it, as we read it, of the story of Jesus. It's this kind of everyday, ordinary, you're growing up years, and yet you have siblings who don't fully understand you, who kind of move away from you.
I would say they misinterpret what he's trying to say.
Yes, they don't know his heart, and honestly, they're always kind of questioning his motives.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it feels like this story where you kind of see family dynamics and insecurities heightened. Yeah. And what I love about that is I think all of us actually feel that, but sometimes when it comes to stories in the Bible, we kind of like elevate it to a point where I could never see myself in that story.
Oh, yeah.
But really, the Joseph story is this huge dynamic of like family insecurities of, my parents have a favorite and everybody knows it. And, you're always having to navigate that. So when I think of his growing up years, I really think of all of our growing up years. There's a lot there. Sure. There's a lot that we can really relate to in the story of Joseph.
Yeah, and there's the dysfunction. I don't think they fully understand this vision that God has given them.
Yes.
And I love what it says in the Bible where it said Joseph came back and gave a bad report on his brothers to his dad. And then he's got the dream thing. So then they start calling him Dreamer, in a mocking way, which again parallels the life of Jesus, right? Like they just, even the crown of thorns, right? Like, all right, King, they do that to Jesus. They're doing that to, all right, Dreamer. Like you think, and you see this theme, God using this as a tool to communicate and reassure Joseph, kind of play out. And so the brothers finally, they have enough of this. And so they're looking for an out to find favor with their dad and find favor with that. And I agree with you, Ashley. We all have those dynamics play out with our siblings. So they decide they're going to kill him. So they throw him into an empty cistern for a little bit. Brandon, pick up the story
it's
there.
It's a little, intense.
So they finally decide, I think it's Judah who speaks up, and Judah's like,
which is the name of my son, which is a little sad.
There you go.
Well, but it'll get better. Yeah. It'll get better. But so Judah finally has the idea, we shouldn't kill him. We should sell him because then we'll get some money. And as it so happens, a slave trade caravan is going past that's headed to Egypt, and they sell their brother. They take his colored coat. They dip it in animal's blood to make it look like he was attacked. They sell him. They go back and tell their dad, like, hey, Joseph has died. And Jacob is heartbroken. Like we kind of talk about the family trauma a little bit there. Like it affects not only Joseph but also Jacob. Like he spends years thinking, his son died.
And they claim a wild animal must have taken him. So there's this big lie for a long time too that.
For a long time.
Like years.
How did they do that?
I don't know. I mean, the guilt and shame, right? Like, I mean, it had to be present, not only doing it, but then lying to your dad and just kind of all these dynamics.
But think about that, like that's a long time for so many people to know such a big secret.
Yeah.
and to hide it. And that is the weight of guilt and shame. Like if you think about that with your family, that is how crippling it is when something so deep in your family is hidden and everybody knows it, but you kind of avoid it.
I didn't think about this, and I'm going to say this coded. I had that happen with someone I know where there was a massive family secret hidden for decades, more than 20 years. And it came out, and then just watching all of it fall apart reminded me the power of confession of sin and finding the cleansing of sin for that. You don't want to do that. And you can only imagine, we don't know what those years were like, but the weight of that, I mean, like when you humanize the story, that is easy to not. The other thing I found interesting is it says that they sell him to the Ishmaelites, which is so fascinating. It comes from the nation, of Ishmael, which goes back to Abram, and it goes back,
There's another family dynamic.
There's another whole other.
So,
that's a different day. You can look that up and discover that. So I find that fascinating that shows up. I didn't really notice that before I was rereading it.
Yeah, I don't think I really noticed.
Yeah. So the Ishmaelites then sell him and take him into Egypt, and an official there that's very high up named Potiphar. He goes into Potiphar's home, and this kind of moves into movement too. We kind of see these up-down moments. So he's in a down, but then he goes up really quickly. He gets into the home of Potiphar, and he is very successful. God is with him. He is righteous in all that he does. He seeks to do the right thing, and it doesn't take long for that to stand out. And I think he's doing it because I think Joseph does everything with a divine purpose. And you guys know that, like, you quickly learn when people are playing you, when they're climbing on you, when they're trying to get above you, when they're trying to get ahead. And this is not how this guy operates.
Yeah.
And he entrusts him with everything except one thing. You want to take it, Brandon?
Yeah, so Joseph, he is head of everything over Potiphar's household. It says, I think the only thing Potiphar worries about is what he's going to eat. That's a level
life,
of,
man.
Yeah, that's a level of trust in people. Like, all I want to worry about is what I eat.
Yeah.
But Potiphar's wife also notices Joseph in the midst of this.
Can I quote, though, the Bible?
Yes.
It says Potiphar's wife says that Joseph was well-built and handsome, and she took notice.
That's one way to say it.
That's one way to say it. Good-looking guy. All right, keep going.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
He's got the physique to match the personality.
That's
He's
right.
the full
He's the
pack.
full package. A perfect
all
10.
right, Brandon, keep going. I keep interrupting.
No, that's okay. So she decides to make a move, I guess, and tries to get Joseph to sleep with her, and he is full of integrity, just like we know him to be. Yes, for days
she's coming after him.
Yeah.
And
don't go too fast through that.
Yeah.
For days,
literally,
you've got this lady coming after you with all the power, coming at you with reward. I mean, trying to manipulate and talk in. Interesting.
Yeah. And he just continually, rebuffs her advances, and it finally gets to the point where she grabs him by the cloak, and he runs like he bolts and leaves his jacket. And he's just out of there. Kind of that picture. I think Paul later uses that picture when he talks about flee from sexual temptation.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to flee from sexual temptation completely naked.
Yeah, and that's what he does.
You just got to get out of there.
Yeah, so it's sort of his undoing. Obviously his wife now is embarrassed. She's getting involved, so she's got the ultimate fallout plan, and she tells Potiphar that it was the reverse, that she was keeping him away, and kind of claims that he's trying to rape her and all these things. And so then he's this kind of movement, he ends back up in prison, right?
Yes.
Like he ends up in prison.
Yeah.
So as we focus in on this dynamic, Ashley, what comes to life to you? What are you thinking about? Like, how can we read this?
Yeah, I have really read this story as the cost of obedience, because I think a lot of times when we read the story, we think, wow, it's really awesome that God ends up, using him and redeeming him, but we don't always look at it as the cost of obedience. What ends up happening to him? He does have to go to jail. He is, in many ways, people kind of question his integrity. And this is maybe too long, so maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. But I did this fun thing like a few series back where Kyle had wanted to do a play it out with, if Joseph wouldn't have, if he wouldn't have, or he would have, given into her advances, what would have happened. So he wanted to do a play it out of all of this that came down to this act of obedience. So everybody ready?
I'm ready.
All right, just buckle up because we're going. Okay, here we go. So Joseph is in charge of all of Potiphar's household and everything he owned. Joseph's good looking. Potiphar's wife, she notices. She continues to insist, and Joseph had every excuse to tell himself, you were thrown into slavery. You deserve this. You've been a great steward of Potiphar's house. Live a little. You work hard, enjoy the benefits that come with where you work. But he doesn't do that. Because Joseph is obedient and runs, he's actually put in jail because Potiphar's wife had his cloak and accused him of trying to sleep with her. It's the cost of obedience. But not really the play it out situation you hope when you obey. When you obey, you're like, I would like to.
You want to be rewarded.
I want to be rewarded.
Sure.
But just play it out, okay? If Joseph would not have run from Potiphar's wife, and I'm going to go forward a little bit in the story, he wouldn't have been put in prison. And if he wouldn't have been put in prison, he wouldn't have met the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, who were officials of Pharaoh. And if he hadn't have met them, he wouldn't have known about the disturbing dreams that they had and needed interpreted. And if Joseph wouldn't have interpreted the dreams of those two, he wouldn't have eventually gotten to sit in the presence of Pharaoh to interpret the dreams. And it goes on and on. If he wouldn't have interpreted those dreams, he wouldn't have been placed over all of Egypt. And if that wouldn't have happened, he wouldn't have made it through the severe famine because God gave Joseph the wisdom to prepare for it. And if Joseph wouldn't have led Egypt to store grain for 70 years, his brothers wouldn't have come to Egypt. And if his brothers wouldn't have come to Egypt, Joseph wouldn't have gotten to see them again, and they wouldn't have known that God had redeemed what his brothers probably felt great guilt for. All of this comes back to this moment of obedience, and we don't often look at the cost of obedience. Yes, it cost him a lot, but it all started here, and we often don't look at how much just one moment of obedience can change literally the entire history of our families' lives, of entire generations, civilizations, just from this one moment. That's how God uses it. It's kind of amazing to think about.
What I like about it too is, one, we have this idea that if I do the right things, I get what I want in return for that. Because in a lot of ways, there's some truth to that, right? Like if I do the right things in school or whatever, I can almost guarantee certain things coming back to me in work life or whatever. But that's just not the way life works out. It doesn't work out. And the other thing that you point out is, and Joseph says this really well, which is things that we think are for our harm, God uses for good. Yes. And that's one of the verses you'll read in this, right? Like what you all meant for harm, God is using for good. Yeah. And we're seeing that play out in real time. And you've advanced our story down because, he stays faithful. There's a cost to this obedience. He goes to prison, and it says in there again, this is what I love, he's favored in prison. And it's not before long he makes friends with the warden. And again, I'll keep pointing out to him, it's because he has a faith in who God is, and he ain't playing games. He's not there to manipulate. He's not there for his own good. He's there for the good of the God he serves, and that just becomes evident to all when you have someone that's not manipulative.
Yeah.
He's got none of that. And again, he's put in charge.
Yeah.
He's put in charge in the prison setting, and then I guess the Pharaoh gets mad and throws his cupbearer and his baker in prison. We don't know what happened, but assuming the food wasn't up to par or something. Yeah. Who knows what would have happened? But he throws
that's a bad place to be.
He throws them in prison, and Ashley, you alluded to it, and they're having these weird dreams, and Joseph says, I could
which happen whenever you eat weird food.
Maybe that's what it is.
So it could all be connected.
He interprets the dreams again. It's kind of sad, right? The cupbearer, the dream is, hey, in 3 days you'll get out and you'll live. The baker goes, well, I got a dream, and he's like, well, in 3 days you'll get out, but you're going to hang on a tree.
I'm sure the baker was excited initially.
Yes. Yeah.
These are great dreams.
Yeah, all in the delivery. Okay. I would deliver it like that. Yeah, I got good news, bad news situation. Yeah. And then sure enough, 3 days later, it happens, right? Like the Pharaoh pulls them out 3 days later. One's hanging, one's living. The cupbearer is restored to goodness in the Pharaoh's household. And then there's a little line in there about Joseph who's been left behind, in prison. And that line is, 2 years later.
Right.
So 2 years now past Brandon. I'm going to let you pick the baton up from there in the story.
No, the cupbearer completely forgets him. Just completely forgets this guy.
Yeah.
And, the good news is we've read a couple times while Joseph is in prison that God is with him. So it's not like he's totally been left alone. But the cupbearer has completely rejected him. And it comes to the point where Pharaoh has a weird dream. And he's telling everybody his weird dream 2 years later. And no one can interpret it. All the wise men they're just at a loss. They don't know. And finally, the cupbearer remembers. And I kind of wonder, that light bulb moment.
Hey, there's a guy left in prison.
Yeah, I know a guy.
Yeah.
I know a guy. And Pharaoh is so desperate, right? That he hears, hey, there's a guy in prison who can interpret dreams.
And
Pharaoh's
can I pause you right there?
Yes.
When you say Pharaoh is so desperate that they'll believe anything and try anything, I can't tell you how many people are in that situation.
Yeah.
Just so desperate for anything to come through, whether it's a financial situation they're caught in or a family thing. It gets to that place where you go, I don't care what it takes. I'm going to do whatever. And he's in that spot to go get a prisoner out. So I'm sorry. I don't want to miss the humanity.
Because I think it's just, it's incredible that a guy said, hey, there's a prison Joe. Yeah. I know him. Like, he can interpret
Prison
your dream.
Mike.
Yeah. And
it's a deep Office reference, but we'll call him Prison Joe. All right.
And Pharaoh's just like, sure, why not? And they dress Joseph up, they clean him up, they bring him up out of prison. and Pharaoh looks at him and says, hey, I hear you can interpret dreams. And Joseph, to his great credit, looks Pharaoh in the eye and says, no, I can't do that. But I serve a God who can interpret your dream. And let's see what he has. That's the message, I think. But anyway. Yeah. So Pharaoh tells him his dream. It involves, 7 healthy cows that get eaten up by 7 skinny cows. Just crazy, crazy dream. No wonder he wants this interpreted.
Yeah.
Like, it was like The Walking Dead. It was just weird. And Joseph says, well, this points towards, you're going to have 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and you need to get ready for it. I'm not one to tell you what to do, but I would say that you should, get someone who can oversee stockpiling your 7 years of plenty, and then you'll have something for the 7 years of want. And Pharaoh says, that's great. That's a phenomenal idea. Joseph, I want you to do that.
Yeah. So again, finds favor.
Yes. Yeah. So he goes in the course of an afternoon from being a prisoner to having the king's ring on his finger, basically saying, go do that.
Yeah.
Go prepare the nation for this famine.
So he begins preparing for this, and now we kind of move into the final movement, and there's a ton of detail here we're going to gloss over, but we're going to need to tie a bow on this story, okay? And, just to back it up to remind you guys of all the movements, his brothers sell him, almost kill him, decide to sell him into slavery. He ends up in the home of Potiphar, a rich Egyptian. Potiphar's wife accused him of rape. He ends up in prison, rots there for a little bit, does some good things, becomes in charge of the prison, interprets some dreams, does the Pharaoh's dream. Now he's back out in charge again. But we still have this larger story playing out, right, where he's got his family left behind, and he's in Egypt, and he's now been in charge. And so he is in charge of stockpiling for 7 years and preparing for the famine. And the famine hits, and then God is orchestrated this grand redeeming story. What happens next within all of this, Ashley? Yeah.
Yeah. So his brothers end up coming because they need food. They're hungry. And, they first come, they don't even recognize him, and they don't know that this is their brother. And some of that can be, you put kind of out of your mind that baggage of the past. Like, you don't want to have to bring that back up. And so it's hard to even imagine that this is where he could be now. But, long story short, they end up leaving for a little bit. Joseph sends them away. Then they come back because Joseph kind of planted a little something in one of the brothers' bags because he knew that they would eventually come back. And so they end up coming back, and Joseph is able to not only provide for them, but to welcome them in and for their family to get to have a provision and a place there. So God ends up using this story in a really crazy way where it starts, literally in the bottom of a cistern. But then God uses it to elevate his people to have provision in every way possible in a time where they didn't know where they would get, a next meal.
Yeah.
God literally provides for them. And so the whole idea of this story is really God bending kind of the evil or the trials of this world into a story of redemption. Yeah. And we see that really as the story throughout our own lives, but throughout the gospel is God bending evil to a place of redemption.
The place of death becomes the place of life.
Yeah.
And there's no more beautiful picture than the cross of that the thing that was intended for harm was for our good. Right. Brandon, when you think about this final movement of the reconciliation to his family again, what sticks out to you? What's your favorite part? They're going to read about it, but what's the thing you're like, I think about this?
Well, I want to go back to Judah because I think Judah,
for her son's name's sake.
Yes. I think Judah has the most interesting arc in the story, because he's the one who says, let's sell him into slavery. And when Joseph plants the silver cup, I think it is, in their baggage, and he tells them, well, you need to leave Benjamin behind. And Benjamin is his full brother. He's another son of Rachel. And it's Judah who stands up and says, please don't keep Benjamin, because our father already lost this Benjamin's brother. And we can't go back and tell him that, please don't do this to our father. And it's at that moment that Joseph breaks down, that he can't do it. He can't keep up the game any longer. And I think it's a really neat picture of redemption, of even relational redemption in the middle of that Joseph sees, oh, they've changed. Like Judah is different now. And I think that's it's really kind of neat. You see, like, Joseph just completely sobs and breaks down at that moment. And it's because I think he sees that repentance and redemption.
And I think this is going to set up to, I love what you were saying, Ashley, the place of death becomes the place of life. You're going to see this play out multiple times throughout, where what was intended for harm is used for good. The thing that we think will destroy us in an earthly sense, in a heavenly sense, far from does that. And I think when I think about my own life, that is so true. Like, when I think about my arc of growing up, of maturing, of becoming who I am, of how God has used me, he has used me far more times because of things I don't wish upon me. But there are things in my story that I go, I can't imagine who I would be without walking that. And I know that's true of all of us, is it's in those low points, a lot of times we find God in a whole new way.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
And you see that play out here. And so out into Egypt, the nation of Israel comes, right? They're kind of a small group coming in. It's the family of Jacob, right? The family of Israel is coming, and it comes during this time. They enter into Egypt. And as we close this time, I like one of the ending points there with Joseph, the very end in chapter 50. It's almost one of the last verses of the book of Genesis. He tells them this in verse 25 of chapter 50. He says, take my bones with you when you leave. Because he knows he is a stranger in a foreign land. And that one day, the land that God had promised this family, they would return to. And we're going to see that play out. How do you think about that bones part when he says, take my bones with me?
I think it's just interesting that he has in the back of his mind, I guess, well, God promised another land to our grandfather, to Abraham. So this is not where we belong. So there's something in him that's already forward thinking that, well, we're not going to stay here. We can't stay here because God has already said we're going somewhere else. And so I think there's that element of faith that Joseph, he shows throughout his life. But, this is something that, like, he can look and say, well, to his brothers, well, what you intended for evil was good, but he won't see his return to the promised land. He dies, and he's bones when they take him to the promised land.
That's so valuable to see, is that he doesn't even get to see the fullness of how God's using this. But what I love is in his final act, he has faith. And he says, hey, these bones are temporarily here. Take them with you. And you see that played out when God redeems them and they leave. You see it play out a couple chapters later in Exodus. You'll read in chapter 13 that the bones leave with the nation of Israel as they enter the promised land.
I think that you really see with that one little verse, this collision of grief and hope. There's real grief because his bones imply that he's dead. So he's gone. That story, it has ended here, but there's this hope of what God is going to continue to do. And I know from my own story, I really see that, like, grief is the bedrock of hope. And and we see God continuing, even in the, when we talk about how God redeems kind of, or can bend evil towards redemption, in the same way he can bend suffering towards redemption. We see that with Jesus on the cross, but we see that in our own stories where God often uses suffering to help us see that he is really all we need. And when everything's good, we often don't have a lens for that. And that's why I think the story of Joseph is so unique and so helpful, because Joseph's story for so much of his life is a story of suffering. And yet God continues to fix his eyes towards what's true. And there's a lot that we can hold on to with that reality, that if he could suffer that much, and yet God used it for him to fix his eyes towards what's true. Then how much more can we now that we have Jesus?
Right.
Yeah.
It's a really encouraging way to see the story of Joseph.
I'm going to close out this time with a verse from the New Testament from Colossians chapter 1 that I think uses this. But before I do that, I'm not going to say it. What's interesting about your two stories is about the same time you both were at your lowest point, because I know both your stories, just as of late. Both of you have walked two different things, very complex, very moments of this. It doesn't come from a place of not identifying.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And literally your stories are at the same time. I don't know if you know that, but some of those same different journeys, different things, but just extreme moments of curveballs of why am I walking through this? But I want to close this with this verse from Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. And I love this. It says, "For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins." That is why we're doing this from Exodus to Easter, because we're going from the story of darkness to the story of light, and the place that was meant for our harm will be used for our good. Thank you guys so much. All right, guys, thank you for joining us on week number 1. Brandon, every week I'm going to pull you up here, and I'm going to say, because you're not always going to be in every week this week you were, but tell me, I want to know two things. Number 1, what was your big takeaway with our conversation with Ashley? It was a ton of fun. And then number 2, what do they have to look forward to in the Bible reading plan, and if they're in a group, in their group time?
Okay. So it's kind of the same answer for both these questions, because I think the big takeaway is how God blesses and works in the midst of our suffering. And Ashley did a great job talking about some of that. One of the things we didn't get to hit on was Genesis 41:52, where Joseph said, he named his son Ephraim because it means God has made me fruitful in this land of grief. And that's what we see in this story, is he made Joseph fruitful. He made good things happen in suffering. So if you're in a group, if you're doing through the Bible reading plan, you're going to see that. You're going to talk about how some of the ways God blessed Joseph in that suffering, and how he does the same for us.
The place of darkness can absolutely become the place that God will shine his light through you. Thank you, Brandon, and thank you guys for joining us.